Well, today we're coming to you from the inside of a place that we have the blessing to be able to enjoy, and it's called Cloud Valley Lodge, and it's in Valley Crucis, North Carolina. This is the home of my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and they have gladly donated it to us for a week of getaway in a very COVID-19 safe environment because we're up here on the top of a mountain and there's no one really around. So it's been a blessing to be here this week. And this is the place where I've been studying and been writing and hanging out with Michelle, and where we're going to share more of the Gospel of Mark today. So join with me, open your Bible, and we're going to be taking a look at Mark chapter 14. And we're going to be looking at verses, I think we're going 43 down to 52, 43, 52. This is the part of the story where we deal with the arrest of Jesus. Up to this point, we've had the upper room, we've had the Last Supper, the Passover meal, where Jesus announced that one of those who were dining with him would betray him. Then we had the trip over from after the Last Supper over to the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus again would say that there was going to be a betrayer, and then he would say that Peter would deny him 3 times. And then in the Garden of Gethsemane, we have a separation of the disciples. He has sat the disciples by the gate, the entrance to the garden. He's taken Peter, James, and John with him further into the garden, and that's where he has knelt down to pray. And 3 times he returns to Peter, James, and John after he has instructed them to stay awake, and he finds them sleeping. And it was this time we talked about last time we were together that we believe that, at least I believe, that this is Judas's exit. Up to this point, I believe that Judas has been traveling around with Jesus and the disciples. I believe he was in the upper room with Jesus. I believe he traveled to the Mount of Olives with Jesus. And it was only in this late night, because remember, we believe this is, sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight that this is happening. It was at this time that Judas would have had the ability to slip away without even being noticed by the disciples. If Judas had left in the upper room, the disciples would have noticed that. If Judas would have left on the way to the Mount of Olives, the disciples would have noticed that. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus takes Peter, James, and John away and prays with them, the rest of the disciples are together by the gate. And we know Peter, James, and John for sure couldn't stay awake, so it's a pretty good guess that the other disciples couldn't stay awake either. So this would have been a perfect opportunity for Judas to take his leave of the disciples, head to the authorities, and set up the arrangements for the betrayal. And so he goes and he gets the people that are going to arrest Jesus. A perfect opportunity for it to happen because everybody would have been slumbering. No one would have been paying attention. And so he could have slipped away without anybody noticing. And now we have the story of where Judas returns with the mob. Judas returns with the authorities and he betrays Jesus. In fact, we have in verse 41 here that we left off last time. It says, Jesus says, "Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Here comes my betrayer." So that's where we left off. And so in verse 42 through verse 43 through verse 52 of chapter 14 of Mark, we're going to have the account of the actual arrest of Jesus. So again, like we've done many times before, we're going to read down through the whole passage, and then we'll go back and we'll take a look at things and kind of pick it apart and try to understand it in a deeper way. So picking up in verse 43 of chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, went from the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going out at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving the garment behind. Thanks be to God for the reading of this word. So we're going to take a look at this story, a story that if you've been a part of any kind of Easter celebration, you've heard the story before, you've experienced the story before. And again, you've probably experienced it with different perspectives from the different Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all deal with this story. And again, as we've talked about before, all of the Gospels have a little different perspective on this story. They're similar in many ways, but there's some different perspectives in their stories. And the reason why is because, as we've said before, the example of a intersection with a traffic light, and it's a four-way stop with the traffic light, and the traffic light malfunctions, and then there's a wreck in the middle of that intersection, and there's a person standing on each one of the four corners. When the police come to investigate the crash and they interview all four of the people on those corners, they will get four different perspectives of the exact same crash, because each person will be seeing it from a different angle. Each person will be seeing it with a different way of seeing it. They will be seeing it from a different direction. They'll be seeing it from a different perspective. They'll be seeing it, at a different time frame. They will turn their head at a different time. So each one of the four will give an account of the same accident, which will be a little bit different. You take all of the four together and you combine it and you get a very clear picture of what has happened. And that's why God has given us the four Gospels. God just didn't give us one Gospel that tells us the story of Jesus. He gave us four so that we could have that 360-degree view of Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry. And so as we're reading this, one of the things that I want to invite you to do is to kind of be open to what Mark is saying. You might have in your mind what John says or what Matthew says or what Luke says, but kind of suspend that for right now and just listen to the words of Mark. Again, a reminder, we believe Mark was a pupil of Peter, so we believe Peter was telling him the story and Mark was recording it. Mark decided to take Peter's teachings and make it into a gospel. Mark is the oldest gospel that we have. And so we understand that this is a perspective that Mark is getting from Peter. And so this is just going to be one aspect, one perspective from one corner of that intersection where the accident happened. And that's okay. For this study, I want to focus on what Mark is saying and what Mark highlights. And that's important for us to take a look at. So as we start off with just as he was speaking. So in this first part of this passage, we know for sure that there's not any time that's passed between verse 42 and verse 43, because it says, let it rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So he sees Judas and the crowd coming. And he probably sees them coming because, we have to understand that we're in the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, and there is this perspective that it's nighttime. We believe it's between 10 p.m. and midnight. So Jesus is able to see the flickering of the torches because, remember, there's no street lights, there's no flashlights or anything in this time. So in order for someone to travel in the nighttime in the dark, they had to have a torch. And so he can see the torches coming, and so he knows that this is the betrayer that's coming. So Mark doesn't change anything, or Mark doesn't add any time there. Mark goes right into it, just as he was speaking. So the words of verse 42 are still coming out. We have the definition. We have the spotlight put on the betrayer. Now, of course, as the readers, we already knew who the betrayer was. We already knew that it was Judas because we had insight. The disciples didn't know. So realize that for the 11 disciples that are experiencing this, they're now learning for the very first time that Judas is the betrayer. So it says, just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, just in case you weren't sure, this is not another Judas. This is not a Judas that was traveling around and just so happened to be there. This was Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs. Sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. And this is important for us to understand. This is Jesus and his disciples, the 11 disciples, because of course Judas was one of the disciples. So this is Jesus and 11 guys. Throughout the course of this 3-year ministry, we have absolutely no record of any violence that Jesus and the disciples carried out. We have no record or no understanding of arms, of weapons that Jesus and the disciples carried. We have no reference to it in any of the Gospels. But yet when Judas brought the people with him, when Judas brought the crowd with him in order to arrest Jesus, they came with clubs, they came with swords. And it's important for us to note this because the importance of this is not in the fact that the people who were coming thought that they were going to need it in order to take Jesus into possession. We still have to remember that this is a political act. That this is an act not done because the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes believe that God is calling them to do this. They have some kind of revelation. This is a political act. Jesus is messing with their power, and they want to get rid of him. But they also know that it's a sensitive time. This is the Passover. We're getting ready to enter into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which will be a week-long celebration in Jerusalem after the Passover. And so they know this is a sensitive time. There's 1 million people possibly in Jerusalem, and Jesus is a pretty popular guy. So they send people with swords and clubs, not because they believe Jesus and the disciples are going to cause a problem. It gives the perspective to the outside eye that they believe that Jesus and the disciples were dangerous. So that's why they sent people with swords and clubs, not because they knew that they were going to find an armed group of disciples there ready to fight. They were doing it for the political view of it. If you want to present to the outsider someone is being dangerous, then you come to them, you approach them as someone who's dangerous. And so we have this picture here, and that's why it's important for us to know that the people who came had swords and clubs, not because Jesus and the disciples were well armed and they were ready to fight, but because it was a political step that they wanted the people, if anybody witnessed this, they wanted to witness what they believed was the chief priests and the elders and the scribes being afraid that Jesus and his disciples were well armed, afraid that Jesus and his disciples were going to bring a fight. And so he says here, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was the crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now, the betrayer, doesn't even mention that it's Judas at this point, but the betrayer, which is Judas, had arranged a signal with them. Now, this is important because we got to remember, again, it's nighttime. The only thing that you have to light the way in Jesus' day are torches. And so it would have been hard to understand in the Garden of Gethsemane at night which one was the man that you were supposed to arrest. Even though Jesus was a public figure, even though Jesus was very popular, you put a bunch of people around, say, a campfire, it's not that easy to see which one is which. It's not easy to see who is who. So they had to make sure that they got the right guy. They didn't want to take this step and then get the wrong guy. So they had made an arrangement with Judas. How are we going to know which one is Jesus? How are we going to know which one we are going to arrest? So now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Those are the words of Judas. So Judas is going to betray Jesus with a kiss. In Jesus' day, a kiss was a very common way for you to greet. There were different kinds of kisses. A slave would greet you with a kiss, maybe kneeling, kiss down towards your feet. Someone who is subservient or someone who is a subordinate to you would greet you by kissing your hand. If you would kiss somebody on the cheek, that was a statement that we are equals, but I'm showing you respect. I'm happy to see you. And so there's this sense and this understanding of the kiss is not weird because that's how people greet each other, but it's important for us to understand how Judas does this kiss. Judas doesn't drop to his knees and kiss Jesus' feet. Judas doesn't grab Jesus' hand and kiss his hand. Judas kisses Jesus on the cheek. And so this is Judas's way of saying that we are equals. This is Judas's way. Again, there's a lot of political stuff going on here. This is Judas's way of saying to the crowd, saying to the people with the swords and the clubs, saying to the people that he's made arrangements with that, I'm on the same level with this guy. Even though Judas probably knew he wasn't, even though we all know that he wasn't, that's what he did. So he betrayed Jesus with a kiss. As he says, the one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. And so this is the arrangement they make. I'm going to kiss him. The man that I kiss is Jesus. So when you see me kiss him, that's your signal. You grab him and you lead him away under arrest. It doesn't say you grab him and you beat him to a pulp. It doesn't say you grab him and stab him. You say you grab him and lead him away. The understanding here has always been from the very beginning the opportunity for the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes to legally do away with Jesus, even though they're doing it in an unethical way. They're doing it for political reasons. They're still going to follow the law. They are going to bring him in, and they are going to try him. They are going to find him a heretic, and then they are going to send him to the Roman officials, as we'll see later on in the story. So they're doing this out of a political aspiration. What they're doing is wrong, and they're going to do it following the letter of the law. So they're not there to kill him. They're not there to beat him. They're there simply to arrest him, to take him to the authorities. And that was the signal that Judas gave him. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. So moving on to verse 45, going at once to Jesus. So when Judas got there, he went straight to Jesus. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. And so Judas calls Jesus Rabbi, which means teacher, authority. And so he calls him by this name of honor, this name of respect, and he gives him the kiss. So he gives him the signal, and he goes immediately and does it. Now, one of the things we have to think about at this time is the people who are witnessing this. Now, granted, Peter, James, John, and the rest of the disciples are having a hard time staying awake in the garden. It's, like I said, it's sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. It's late. They've had the big Passover meal. They've had the celebration. They've been up all day preparing and getting ready. So it's been a long day. So they're tired. And now, all of a sudden, they're standing in this garden, and they're still wiping the sleep from their eyes. Some of them are still yawning. And here comes Judas. And so all of this is happening right in front of them. So just imagine for a second being one of the disciples, and you're there. You just kind of woke yourself up off of a slumber in the Garden of Gethsemane. You're kind of standing there, wiping your eyes a little bit, and all of a sudden you see this crowd of people coming, and as they're getting closer, you realize that there's people with swords and people with clubs, and you're like, what's going on? Then all of a sudden you notice that Judas is the one that's leading them, and Judas walks right up to Jesus and says, Rabbi, and kisses him. You've got to be wondering what's going on. You might be quick enough to put it together and say, oh, Judas is the betrayer, but probably not. Probably at this point, you're still wondering what's happening. You're still struggling with what's going on because you're just waking up. It's late at night. It's a very confusing scene. And so it's important for us to always remember that in the back of our minds, that this is a very confusing scene, especially for the disciples as they're watching this. So going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. So there wasn't like he kissed him and he said, hey, this is the guy, come get him. No, they knew the signal. So he kissed Jesus. He called him Rabbi and kissed him. And then immediately Jesus was pounced upon. Immediately the people with the swords and the clubs came and they arrested him. They grabbed him up. And so this is happening. This is happening right in front of everybody. So going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Now, this is one of those things where I'm going to ask you to suspend your understanding of other gospels. In the other gospels, we have a focus, or we have a name that's given to this person who draws a sword and cuts off the ear, and that's Peter. And I'm not telling you, or I'm not saying that that's incorrect. I'm just saying in the Gospel of Mark, it does not give us a name. So in this study that we're doing today, please, let's just stay right there. Let's just stay right there with the unnamed person. This could be Peter, this could be someone else, but let's stay with the unnamed person. Let's stay with Mark's gospel and how he puts it here. And so then one of those standing near. So in Mark's gospel, it doesn't even say it's a disciple. Which, when you think about it, kind of makes sense, because did the disciples carry around swords with them on a regular basis? If they did, we have no mention of it. If they didn't, then why are they carrying one this night? So there's this notion, this understanding in the Gospel of Mark that we don't have a name for this person. That this person is one who's standing near. It doesn't even say one of the disciples. It says one of those standing near, understanding that there probably were other people that were there. Again, This is Passover, moving into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There are probably, we believe, upwards to close to 1 million people in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's not that big of a city. So there would have been people who would have been staying on a regular basis out in the Garden of Gethsemane. There would have been people who would have been there just like Jesus and the disciples went there. So this crowd that comes not only comes for Jesus and the disciples, they come and they're being seen by others. And again, that's why they came with the swords and the clubs, because they wanted the others to see Jesus and the disciples as dangerous. And so it just says, one of those standing there drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And it's interesting because we don't have a description of who did the cutting, but we do have a description of who got cut, and that is a servant of the high priest. And he cut off his ear. He cut off his ear. Now, I don't know what the significance of the ear is. The first thing that I think of when I read that is I think of all the times that Jesus says, any of those who have ears to hear, let them hear, let them listen. You know, this understanding of the ear and the significance of hearing, the significance of the fact of what Jesus is getting ready to say about where he's been and what he's been doing. So you can probably read a lot into the understanding of the ear was cut off, and whatever you come up with is wonderful. But it is a description. We have the mention of the servant of the high priest and the cutting off of his ear. And so we have this ear that's been cut off by this unnamed person who has a sword. And in that next verse, am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus. So that's the first thing he says in response. Again, other gospels, we have stories of Jesus picking up the ear and healing him and everything. But again, I'm asking you to suspend those other gospels, suspend those other understandings. And let's just look what Mark says. And so Jesus says, am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus? And this is a word to not only the people who are coming with the swords and the clubs because they're trying to portray Jesus and his disciples as dangerous. It's also a word to the person who just struck off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And basically saying, that's not what I'm about. That's not why I'm here. This is not a military thing. This is not a revolution thing. This is a salvation thing. This is a creation thing. This is a nature of God thing. This is the trajectory of history thing. There's something so much bigger going on here than simply rebellion. And he says, am I leading rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? That you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? This notion of saying you had come addressing me like I'm someone dangerous. You come addressing me like I am going to hurt you. You come addressing me like I'm some kind of military leader. Again, that misunderstanding of Jesus as Messiah. Again, everybody, the disciples, us included to this day, struggle with the suffering servant aspect of Jesus. As Jesus, not as warrior king, but Jesus as suffering servant, Jesus as lamb, sacrificial lamb of God. And so Jesus, in response to this coming with the clubs and the swords, Jesus, in response to this cutting off of the ear of the servant of the chief priest, he says, am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts. Every day I was in the temple courts teaching. There were no weapons. There was no violence. Every day you saw me there. Every day I was there, and yet you didn't do anything. But yet tonight you come with clubs and swords. And so he's pointing out not only to the people, not only to the disciples, but also to the people who are arresting him. What are you doing? You're really kind of going overboard here. There's no need for this. But again, it was important because this is a political arrest. This is a political staging. This is something that's being done specifically to portray Jesus in one light, to portray Jesus and his disciples as someone dangerous. He says, am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. The scriptures must be fulfilled. And notice he doesn't say the scripture must be fulfilled. He says the scriptures must be fulfilled. Basically, everything that is happening in this moment, everything that is happening in this time is a fulfillment of what God has already told, is a fulfillment of what's already been planned. And we can go back to Old Testament passages in Jeremiah and Isaiah and Zechariah, and we can find many things that represent this event, many prophecies that lead us to an understanding of what's happening to Jesus. And it's important for us to realize this because Jesus' life and ministry is all about fulfilling the prophecy. Jesus' life and ministry was all about not doing something new, but bringing to completion that which has always been. And so this understanding is essential. And we look at this and what Jesus is saying to the people as he's expressing this frustration. Why do you come with swords and clubs? Why are you cutting off the ear of the servant of the chief priest? Why is this seeming to be turning into a military thing? But as the scriptures proclaim, this notion of the prophecy, that Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy. And we see this over and over again in his ministry where Jesus is fulfilling some prophetic word of the Old Testament. And some people have argued that they said, well, all Jesus did was he was a scholar of the Old Testament, so everything that he read in the Old Testament about the Messiah or about a leader in some way, he just lived out. He just created. Well, let's think about that for a second. You can maybe create scenarios where some things can happen, but how do you create a scenario where one of your followers betrays you? How do you create a scenario where you're in the garden and you're arrested? How do you create a scenario where Roman soldiers will gamble for your clothes? How do you create a scenario where all these things that require other people to take action happens? You can't. You can't do that. Yes, you could probably make an argument that there's some things that, you could orchestrate and make it look like that. But not everything. And Jesus fulfills everything. Jesus fulfills all of the prophecy of the Old Testament when it comes to the Messiah, when it comes to what God has been doing since the beginning of time. And so he's saying in this moment, just as he said earlier in his prayer, let this cup pass, but not my will, but your will be done. He says, but the scripture must be fulfilled. So basically, hey, I get it. You're coming to me with your swords and your clubs. You're coming with me with all this military show of power because you want me to appear to be someone dangerous to the outsiders. You want me to appear to be someone dangerous for your political advantage. And that's frustrating, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. The scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and left. Again, on more completion and more fulfilling of scripture. At this point, remember, Jesus just got done earlier that evening telling the disciples that they were going to betray him. That one of them was going to betray him, and he tells Peter specifically that you're going to betray me 3 times. And here we have everyone deserting him. So basically, when this went down, then all of the disciples scattered. All the disciples ran. Now, let's not be too hard on them. Let's think about this for a second. This is a pretty scary situation. Excuse me, you're with Jesus, and you know that this is a boiling point kind of moment because this week has been quite a different week for you. You understand that Jesus has got a problem with the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. They don't like him much. You've known this for years. And so now here you have a situation where armed people are coming to arrest Jesus, and they arrest him. And not only do they arrest him, but one of your very brothers, one of your friends, one of your co-disciples is the one that leads the betrayal. So at this point, it's very, very, very confusing. And as human beings, we are fight or flight. We've already seen some of the fight because one of those that were there took out their sword and struck off the ear of the servant of the chief priest. Now we see the flight, because Jesus basically has put a kibosh to that. Even if everybody there was, after that guy cut off the servant's ear, they're drawing their swords and they're ready to go to battle. They're ready to fight. Jesus puts a kibosh on that because he says, what am I, leading an armed rebellion? I've been with you this whole time teaching in the temple courts and you've never done anything. And now you come to me with swords and clubs like I'm someone dangerous. So in that speaking, he's basically telling those who are hoping for a fight or looking for a fight, there's not going to be any fight. So now the fight aspect is taken off the table. So what's left? Flight. That's it. And so all the disciples flee. Everyone leaves. As it says here, it says, Then everyone deserted him and left. Everyone deserted him and left. Not some, but everyone deserted him and left. They flew. They said, we're out of here. And again, it's that understanding of the betrayal of Jesus. It's that understanding of what he was talking about. And so in essence, with that notion, we can go back to Jesus' words earlier this evening about one of you are going to betray me, one of you who's sitting at the table with me. Basically, he was saying, all of you are going to betray me. But which he does say later on the way to Garden of Gethsemane. He says that all of you will fall away. Well, here we see it. All of them have fallen away. And then Mark adds this very interesting little caveat at the end, because he could have ended it there. Because Jesus is now arrested. They're taking him off to the chief priests, the elders and the scribes. And everybody has deserted him. But he doesn't stop there. Mark continues. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving the garment behind. And so here we have the description of an unnamed person. He's not one of the 12, but he is someone that's following Jesus. Now we understand this to be the case that Jesus always had a following of people around him. So this was one of those people that was following Jesus, even though he wasn't one of the 12. He might have been in the upper room for the Passover meal. He might not have been. He might have caught up with them on the way to the Mount of Olives. We don't know when he connected with them, but he is one that follows them. And we know what he's wearing. He's wearing a linen garment, which is kind of weird because of the fact that it wasn't a full garment outfit with a tunic and everything like that. It was just this linen garment. And when they seized him, he would much rather shed all of his clothes and run away from the Mount of Olives naked than be caught. And this is a symbol, at least for me, the way that I understand it, this is a symbol of who we are as human beings. You've heard that old saying that I came into the world naked, I'll go out of the world naked. I came into the world with nothing, I go out of the world with nothing. He was willing to go out of the garden with nothing. He was willing to leave everything as opposed to be caught, leave everything as opposed to be associated with Jesus. And I've always taken this as an understanding of the human nature, that this unnamed young man who with the linen garment is a representation of us as human beings. Because how many times have you and I in our lives basically done everything in our power to leave a situation instead of come alongside Jesus? How many times have we found ourselves in an uncomfortable situation and we've kept our mouth closed? How many times have we found ourselves in a situation where we know deep down we had to do something, but we didn't do it because we were afraid of the political ramifications. We were afraid of what would happen to us. And so basically, in essence, we stripped ourselves naked and we ran away. And this is what we see here. And I think Mark shares this little piece of this story because it gives a representation that this is not just a disciple thing. This is a worldly thing. This is not just the disciples. This is human beings, that in humanity we struggle with this, that when push comes to shove, even though we might believe something, we strip ourselves naked, anything. We do whatever we need to do to get away, to get out of it, get away from it. And this is again the fulfillment of prophecy in Scripture that says that all of the people will leave him. And this is a representation not just of the disciples leaving him, but this is a representation that in this moment in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is being arrested, that the world left him. The world abandoned him. Creation, basically, in this moment, as meaning human beings, left him in this time. No one took up for him. No one defended him, other than the person who struck the ear off of the slave of the chief priest, which Jesus already poo-pooed and said, "Don't do that." And so we have, I think, a representation of us as human beings. How many times in our life do we betray Jesus? Because we would rather strip naked and run away as opposed to stand and be seized for the Lord. Be seized saying, as for me and my house, I will serve the Lord. And so there's a lot to contemplate in that, in this understanding of the betrayal here. The betrayal that Jesus experiences is not just the betrayal of Judas. The betrayal that Jesus experiences is not just the betrayal of the disciples. The betrayal that Jesus experiences in this moment in the Garden of Gethsemane, the fulfillment of scriptural prophecy, is the betrayal of human beings, the betrayal of the human race. And that is something that Jesus is going to the cross for. This is something that Jesus is going to suffer for, even though we betray him. Jesus died even while we were still sinners, even while we were betraying him. And I think there's some significance to that. Well, that's where we're going to stop today, because next week we're going to go into Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and we'll pick up with his trial. We'll call it a trial right now, but it's a mock trial. And this is something that's kind of right out of the headlines today. I mean, it would be something like watching court TV, but from 2,000 years ago. And so I hope that you join us for that next week, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. And I pray that there's blessing here for you. And so until then, I pray that you stay safe and you stay sane.